Marina Lyon, thank you very much for agreeing to speak. It's obviously an extremely rare person who can say that they've been in the same room as Russian President Putin once, let alone on multiple occasions. Can you give people a sense of your family background, and particularly your parents' positions in the late Soviet period that arguably set you up to cross paths with such high-level figures?
Okay, well, Sam, thank you very much for your interest and for inviting me to share my recollections of my father, Anatoly Pronin, and me growing up in the Soviet Union, and then some of the recent events that are transpiring in front of our eyes. So I can say that my father truly lived through some tectonic changes, shifts, and major events in history that contributed to formation of his character and essentially his destiny. If you think about it, he was born in 1928, which was only a decade after the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and 6 years after the formation of the Soviet Union. It was December 1922 when Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, that was carved by Lenin out of Russian territory, Caucasus Republic and the Far East Republic decided to sign an agreement to form a union. Dad was born in a village in a rural area near to the southern city of Oryol. And you can imagine that after the revolution and all the civil wars, the level of devastation and destruction and suffering was enormous. And also it was the time when an orthodox communal way of Russian living was changing because of the revolution and the working class doctrine becoming a predominant one. And the villages, the farmers were in a way on the receiving end of all the suffering that was instigated by the authorities at the time. But those hardships and difficulties really contributed to the formation of a different class of people from a DNA standpoint. You know, some people call them made out of steel, and that's certainly what I remember my father being. He was carrying a lot of light around him. He was very kind, very thoughtful, very sensitive, but he had a core, and that core, I can't remember being bent, whatever the circumstances. Now, going back to those early years in his life, to his childhood, just a little digression to historical reminder. After the revolution, one of the aims of the USSR political leaderships was to industrialize the country, because Russia at the time was predominantly an agricultural society. And what they started with was introducing what they called the new economic policy, which was aimed to promoting entrepreneurial systems, developing small businesses, and it was almost a necessity. But it wasn't enough, and ideologically was very opposing to the main doctrine of the Communist Party, where private property is an evil thing, you have to get rid of it, when the working class ideologically is much better and above those little interests of private property owners. So very quickly, the focus of the economic policy at that time shifted towards essentially extorting value out of the village, out of the farmers, because they were still producing food, they were still supplying it to the cities. Food stamps were distributed in towns and cities at the time, not available in the villages. And the farmers, the villages, they received very steep quotas of wheat supply that was then exported and money earned from export were directed towards industrialization. And in terms of the impact on those who lived in the village, obviously it deteriorated their standards of living. So was a massive famine in southern Russia and what's now is the territory of Ukraine. And that was my father's sort of baby years and early childhood years. So it was very, very difficult for him. And I remember him talking to me saying that sometimes they had to chew on straw because there was nothing to eat. And once he said he had to eat, he couldn't stop eating honey that was produced on his father's farm. In one go, once he ate 3 liters of this honey, and that caused some health issues for him, diabetes, and in later life, because it was a massive consumption of sugar, and that wasn't very healthy. This period, 1932-35, you might have had cost in terms of lives about 5 million of Russian farmers. It was an enormous tragedy, and that was all developing in front of my father's eyes, and he was a child at that time, and that contributed to his drive for providing for the family, being successful. Because, and it's an interesting psychological phenomena when people have all the essentials, that tend to be less motivated when they don't, and it is for a long time in their lives. They seem to be more driven, more ambitious, more clear in terms of their value systems. And if you think after the revolution, majority of people were illiterate. By early 40s, about 90% were literate, which is amazing in such a short space of time. All of father's siblings and he himself got university degrees. And you ask yourself a question, how was that possible that in a family that was a rural family focused on agriculture, you had all of those children that were driven towards learning more, getting something better out of life, not being stuck just, sitting and twiddling their fingers.
And that was primarily their parents that you think drove that?
My personal view is that if you live in the village, which is a communal society with established norms and social expectations, it's a commune, it's a shared vision. It must have been the parents who changed that, because prior to that, and of course the authorities, they were very much focused on enabling education for children.
Would you say that your father was particularly ideologically committed to the idea of the Soviet Union? Do you think he approved of what you described, the new economic policy? Or that he saw it as like a betrayal of the ideals of communism?
Well, my father was a member of the Communist Party, and the years I'm talking about was still his sort of early teenage years. It was very early in his childhood. I think later in his life, it was clear that he is not committed to orthodox interpretation of the communist ideas, but he clearly believed in equality. He clearly believed in some of the core values that the communism ideology was trying to make their basis. For example, he had been very hardworking all his life, and that is both from the communist ideology and from his upbringing. He clearly believed in defending the weak. He always told me that those vulnerable had to be helped if we could. So I think when you are a young person in any society, even nowadays, when you are 10 or 12, it's difficult to form an ideology. It's only at the end of your life you critically look at your life and say, okay, I believe X, Y, Z, or I don't. So, but given that he worked in the Communist Party, he made his way up into the highest ranks of the Communist Party. I believe he was sharing those ideals and those goals that were established by the authority at the time. But let me take you back a little bit to what other periods contributed to Dad's character, and it's quite interesting. He was 12 years of age when German Nazi invaded Russia. And German army very quickly advanced into the Russian territory, and the area where he lived was occupied by the Germans. The family tried to evacuate, tried to flee, but the advancement of the Nazis was faster than any normal person without a car, because they used horses and carts at the time. There was no car. Was fast, and the family quickly realized that they're not going to preempt the advancement, and they decided to go back. And there was another reason why they decided to go back, and that is that my father's father, my grandfather, was asked by Russian military to become essentially an intelligence agent in what they called at the time Uprava, and that is the rural administration that the Nazi army was establishing in every city or every village that they occupied. And grandfather had access to documentation, letters, etc. So he was gathering intelligence information and then sharing it with designated people where he lived. And it was a very brave thing to do, because he knew what risks he was exposing himself to, his wife, and his 4 children. Nonetheless, he did that. And unfortunately, this act of heroism later in father's life backfired and was a boomerang, which was not fair, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. So that's the sort of second big phase in stage in my father's life, where again, suffering, deaths, hostility was predominant in the environment he lived, and nonetheless, his personal character somehow was quite the opposite. It's those kindness, as I say, equality, interest for knowledge, openness. These were the traits my father had. When the war was over, he was enrolled into a technical college to get a vocational degree, and he graduated with excellence, which gave him the right of getting into a university of his choice. Now, mind, it was the end of the 40s, so what a big jump from a literate population to free right to education in best universities if you can show that you studied well. So he chose the place called the Academy of Agriculture in Moscow. And that's where he met my mom, and they married in 1953. And I must say that it was a love story that lasted for 62 years. And I was very lucky to be raised in a family where parents were so much in love with each other. It's a topic for a separate discussion probably, but again, that impacted me in the way I perceive the relationships, the world. It gives me a lot of strength, what I can remember from those relationships. So when they both graduated from university, their first assignment, and at the time you couldn't choose where to work. Once you graduated from university, because it was free education, you sort of had to pay your duty back. And the way it was done through some sort of a clearance system after graduation, you could get a job anywhere, Far East, Siberia, Moscow, Leningrad, wherever. You didn't have a say. And Dad gets a job, luckily not that far from Moscow, 60 kilometers to the south in the city of Bronici. He was the chief engineer in what they call then machinery and tractor stations. And the main role was to provide tractors equipment for the collective farms. So it was like an engineering branch of the agricultural establishments. And so he worked there, and life was very basic. And Mom and Dad lived in a wooden house. They didn't have any water supply. They had to bring it in buckets from a water well. They didn't have any gas. They used pechka. They had to put fire into the Russian pechka, which is an oven of some sort, and cooked food in the oven. So, and you think, living such a basic life, where did my dad get this idea that he wants to go further? And that were the years when he decided to do a PhD. And he applied for a place to do a PhD in the Russian Institute of Economy in Moscow, or it was a USSR Institute of Economy. And because he was, there were some entry requirements and he passed them. And 4 years after, he got his PhD and started working as a junior research fellow in the same institute. He was bright, very creative, very energetic, full of ideas, and very quickly he was noticed and invited to work in what was called at the time the State Planning Committee, because Russia economy or USSR economy was planned 5-year cycles and very regulated. I always thought it probably was a little bit abused, the system of planning, because everything was planned, even how many nails are to be produced in the Soviet Union. But the concept itself is a good one. And I mean, I've been working in a big international corporation for many years, and we do have 5-year cycle plans, and we do plan things, maybe not that granular, but the concept itself was very good. Again, he impressed a few people so much with the way he conducted himself in this job. And he was invited then in 1964, that is Brezhnev's time, to work into the organization called the Central Committee of Communist Party. To give you an idea how the USSR was managed, everything was controlled by the Communist Party. And the top forum for the Communist Party was a Congress that took place every 5 years. In between, it was the Central Committee of the Communist Party that was responsible for setting the strategy, the objectives, the goals, while the USSR also had the government. But the government was more akin to an executive power where somebody sets the objectives in general direction and the government is executing it. And within this Central Committee of the Communist Party, there were at different times from 10 to 24 different departments. And to name a few, it would be an ideology department, legal department, agricultural department, the socio-economic department, etc. So Dad was invited to work in the agricultural department that was overseeing the developments in Russian agriculture, with the main objective to provide food security or food supply security. And there were, in the whole of apparatus of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, they had about 2,000 people working. And mind, at the time, the total population of USSR was 300 million. So it's really a select small group of people. Some of them had more influence on the direction the country was going than members of political bureau of the Communist Party itself. But each member of the political bureau was sort of curating the different segments and sectors of economy.
So your dad was one of these curators in charge of agriculture?
No, he was invited as the instructor into the agricultural department in 1964, and then he rose to the deputy head, and then he rose to the head of this department, and the curators were different people at different times. But one of them that you would sure know about is Mr. Gorbachev. So Mr. Gorbachev was brought from Stavropolsky Krai to curate the agricultural segment of USSR economy, early 80s, I suppose. That's where my father got to know him, and they worked very, very closely. Over time, Gorbachev became the curator of agriculture. He worked with father. I must say, from my recollections, and one has to check his historical facts carefully, I was a kid, I was a young girl. So, but what I remember that saying was that, unfortunately, Gorbachev's achievements in handling agriculture are questionable. He was more focused on his own career. There was even a joke going around at the time that the volume of wheat produced in the USSR is inverse to Gorbachev's political ambitions. But he was charming. He could be convincing. He was young compared to geriatric leadership, as some people called it. He was only young, early 50s. And
did you ever cross paths at any point?
Me personally?
Yeah.
No, not with Gorbachev.
Do you think he might have ever entertained ambitions of perhaps having Mr. Gorbachev's job, or like being, the leader, given what he said about Gorbachev's competence, or maybe lack of competence?
I can't remember him saying that, but if you're asking me, was he capable? The answer is yes. Did he have those ambitions and thoughts? I don't know, because he never shared that with me. But in terms of capabilities, yeah, absolutely. If he were to be the curator of agricultural sector in the USSR, I don't think there was anything that would have stopped him from being successful. Coming back to Dad, he had a very interesting job. I can hardly remember him being at home, which is, again, an interesting thing, because a lot of things that I was taught outside of school, it was with Dad. And in spite of the fact that he spent very little time with family, somehow he managed in this compressed time to transfer some of his, on a fatherly basis, because it wasn't lectures, but some of the core beliefs, some of the values, some of the, and I still nowadays, long since he passed, I ask him a question and I go back to those early years and I think, what would you have said, Dad? What shall I do? And more than often than not, I get an answer. So somehow it works. But when he started working in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, I can't remember him talking much about Brezhnev. But what I do remember is he traveled a lot. He went on business trips to Europe quite frequently, Germany, Netherlands, at the time Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, with the main objective to learn best practices in agricultural management. And then he would come back and he will make changes to the way it was handled in the USSR and see improvements. And it was visibly improving in Brezhnev's time. In fact, those years, I would say, were the golden years of my life because, look, I had access to everything. Education was free, medical care was free. We didn't live a very privileged life. It was modest. You know, we had a nice apartment, we had good, cheap food, free education. We didn't travel abroad on holidays, but USSR was so large, you know, sometimes we'd go to the Black Sea, to the Crimea. I remember Crimea very well, or to Sochi, or to Adler, the Black Sea coast closer to Georgia, or to the pre-Baltic resorts. We didn't have a car, and sometimes with work they will supply a driver, but it's only on one-off basis. My wardrobe was a far cry from high fashion. I had a school uniform and maybe a couple of other casual things, but there's no thought about, competing with the way you look. I mean, it was mostly about knowledge. One biggest privilege we had is Dad had this, because of his position, he had access to or right to buy books before they were released to general public. So every month there will be a list of books that will be published, so he could tick, 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 and that way my parents gathered this jewel that we have in Moscow, a big library, and that was the predominant way of spending your free time, reading, which I think the skill that is now evaporating or has already evaporated, unfortunately.
So how privileged do you think you were in comparison to the population at large?
At the time, I didn't think I was, because I would return from school, I would have to swipe the floor, peel potatoes, do something. We didn't have any domestic help, but in terms of where I was, which was in Moscow, the schools in Moscow probably were more advanced in terms of teachers. The fact that I was in the center of cultural life with access to theaters, museums. But at the time, it didn't feel that way. I felt like I was equal of equals. And that was an interesting thing. When I was at school, never ever once in my life, I remember any thoughts in my head or my friends, classmates or teachers in terms of differentiating anybody by gender or nationality or background. It was just not there. It was absent. And that is such a stark contrast to what's happening nowadays, where your ethnicity or your color of skin or your gender, that was a very strong advantage of the education in the Soviet Union, rooted in ability rather than some other artificial features.
Ahead of its time.
Artificial, yeah, that's very different now. That's very, very different now. It was a happy time, very happy time. Now, then late Brezhnev's time, they called stagnation, and they coincided with escalation of international relations. And that's where Mikhail Gorbachev started raising to power. And I think it's not even ideology, it's ideals perspective. Gorbachev had some ideals which were quite formidable. What he didn't have is a clearly defined path from an idea that could be formidable to execution.
But your father's proximity to Gorbachev, when he ultimately became the general secretary, he still, noticeably moved up as a result of that, despite his disagreement.
My father was already very senior when Gorbachev came. And in fact, there was a story that I think could give a little bit of an insight into what Gorbachev was as a human being, because you can make judgment about him as a politician. I know West adores Gorbachev. Most people born in the USSR and who witnessed the collapse of the USSR despise him. And I know the only person he truly was loyal to and adored was his wife, Raisa. As far as everybody else is concerned, at workplace, he could even be very rude. He liked to swear a lot, use the swear words. But remember, I told you about my grandfather who was left as an intelligence agent. In the Communist Party, there was this body called party control. Essentially, it was like a disciplinary part of the Communist Party. So in I was graduating from university at the time. I remember Dad came home very, very, very upset. And what happened? This communist control body received an anonymous letter alleging that my grandfather was a traitor because he worked for the Nazis, and therefore his son is not worthy of the position, the senior position he is holding in the Communist Party, which obviously, was not true. But Dad didn't have any documents to prove that. He was dismissed from his position in a day. He went to Gorbachev and said, hey, we've been working together for a long time. Here is what's happening. It's not fair. Please ensure there is proper investigation. And Gorbachev didn't want to know. So my father was dismissed. He didn't work in this role for a few years. He was reinstated in 3 years' time, but he spent 3 years going back to archives, traveling to the city overall, talking to people, finding those initial documents, and ultimately he prevailed. But at the time, it caused him a heart attack, and you would have thought that this camaraderie that you have, and particularly if you are that senior and it's a closed-knit circle of senior people, Gorbachev didn't want to know. He just completely removed, again, because he was focused on something else.
He must have felt a great deal of betrayal over that.
Yes. And I think it was traumatic for Dad, but it also caused him to reevaluate some of the things, because even when he was in his sort of young adult years, those ideals of communism could be very, very appealing. The very honorary, all of those, make life better, make sure that people have free education, free medical care, make sure that we compete with the West. All of that was very, but then he started, and I think by the end of his life, he was more a believer in social democratic doctrine rather than communist doctrine. He also believed in private property. And so he by the end of his life, he soberly, not blindly, but soberly criticized some of the fundamentals, or at least some. And of course, he had an opinion of some people in the upper echelons of the Communist Party. That's why for him, and for me as well, I know that many criticize Putin for statements he made about biggest tragedy of his life was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I can understand that, because for my father, to a greater extent, he grew up with the Soviet Union. Essentially, he was the contemporary of the Soviet Union, born 6 years after it was formed. And then he worked so hard to contribute to the state being strong, to people's well-being, and then to see it all falling apart. It was tragic. And by that time, he was already over 60, so you couldn't really start your life afresh at this age, although Dad did. He did work all the way up until he was 76 or 77. He worked in a private enterprise. So it tells you. But I think that a lot of tragedies, including Ukraine, would have not been possible if USSR survived. And you can think about reasons why it collapsed. And there is a school of thought saying that it was colossal on those weak legs, and that from an economic standpoint, technological standpoint, at some point of time, it started to lag the development of the rest of the world. I don't think so. I think it was due to the fact that two particularly historic figures, one Gorbachev and two Yeltsin, couldn't really agree on how to divide the power. And unfortunately, they have thrown the whole country under the bus. So coming back to Ukraine, I cannot imagine in a million years, should Ukraine stayed within the boundaries of a different or bigger country, we would have seen the situation we're seeing today, which is an absolute tragedy from a humanitarian point of view. And there is somebody to answer for those. Maybe they were unintended consequences, but that's coming back to the statement I made earlier that Gorbachev had an idea, but no path to execution, and certainly no risk assessment for what they were doing at the time.
So after your father was vindicated, after someone made these accusations and he was reinstated, when exactly was that? That must have been very close to the end.
Yeah, it was 1988, and Soviet Union collapsed in 91.
Did he remain in that position right up until the end?
Yes, he did. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And apart from his technical title, would it be an accurate sort of summary of his position to say that he was, because the impression I got from what you've said is that he was basically the deputy in charge of agriculture in the Soviet Union. Is that?
Yes and no. You see, USSR was a collegial management system. So he was very influential in this collegial decision-making relating to agriculture, but it's not a clear line of accountability the way sometimes we have it in the West, where you're in charge of something and that's it. I mean, it was a collegial way of making decisions. In terms of content, yes, you're right. My dad was the one who was forming the agricultural policy, who was controlling its execution, and he was very, very influential in that sense. And by the way, you've seen this collegial way when decision for the special military operation in Ukraine was made. As our current president, Mr. Putin, put it on show on the television, the State Security Council. That's rooted back into this collegial way of managing a country,
Right,
where you share responsibility. It is a big country. It is a complex economy. It is so large. It's so wealthy in the sense of access to all the resources and land, and that then, from an international perspective, I remember it very clearly. I felt that Russia was under siege, not literally, but was under attack. That's why the Cold War. And currently, I feel that in some ways, the objective judgment in terms of understanding what Russia is all about from the West is missing. Its attitude very often by the West is based on, I wouldn't say open hostility, but in this almost feeling that, hey guys, you're too big. Why do you deserve to be so big and so wealthy? It's almost like attempt to challenge what God has given Russia land to be. And there's complete misunderstanding of this mysterious Russian soul from Western people. They just don't understand how we think.
Well, so after the end of your father's political career, do you think, given that he was obviously part of, such an exclusive, the exclusive crop of people who ran the state for so many years, do you think that in some way launched your career in being able to walk in such high-flying circles?
Well, it must have done, but I don't know. I can't articulate what did. I think one of the very strong messages from Dad to me was also education. Is always learn, study, never rely on husband or whatever. You have to be your own person. That was very, very strong. And yeah, I guess I was lucky and in a way, right, privileged that I was in Moscow, therefore access to, because when I graduated, I went also to work and when I graduated, I did my PhD in basically, it was interesting, in US economy, in agricultural sector of US economy. And then I went to work for Scientific Research Institute, like my father did in his early years as a junior research fellow. And then I got married and had Anna, my daughter. And then my ex-husband was posted to Australia to work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, in the embassy in Australia, in Canberra, which Anna spent her early formative years. It was only when she was 9 years of age we returned back to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that's where my father's DNA kicked in, because it was in complete shambles. And where I was raised, I told you, everything free, everything is accessible. Now, nothing is free. You have to pay for everything. Nothing is accessible because it simply does not exist. And I had to scratch my head. What do I do? So guess what I did? I went into employment agency and they said, I need a job. And what would you prefer? I said, I just need a job that pays enough money for me to look after my family. And they gave me 3 opportunities. I passed 3 interviews. One was with Conoco at the time, oil and gas. Another one was with a shipping company. And another one was Johnson & Johnson, pharmaceutical, that was products. And Conoco came through with an offer first. So I took the first that came. And that's how I ended up in the oil industry. I don't have an oil background at all. I am a political economist by background. And from there, again, kind of repeating in a different way, but nonetheless, on a basic level, repeating father's steps, I was noticed, posted to London to work for Conoco's president at the time as his advisor. And since then, I changed. I went to work for Shell and then Chevron. So high flying circles, we were working on a deal, and we negotiated a memorandum of understanding. The MOU was signed in Mr. Putin's residence, and that was 2009, 2010 framework. And he has been in power by that time for 10 years or so, various roles. Putin is not a very tall person, but he has a big presence. That's what I remember. So we spent maybe half an hour, 40 minutes with him talking about this particular project. And then there was a press conference. And 2 other times when I had a privilege to meet him was during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which is an annual event that Russia hosts for investors of all industries, not just oil and gas. But normally they run separate sessions for oil and gas. And a couple of those years I visited this forum. I was again in the same room amongst others with Mr. Putin. And outward policy has always been, when he talked about it, welcoming to investors. There was a lot of caution and a lot of second thoughts when international oil companies made commitments to Russia, because they just didn't trust the Russian state to keep their promises. Now, whether it's founded or unfounded, it's up to everybody's judgment. But that was interesting, and I met Mr. Medvedev in the same forum as well, in the same. So yeah, I guess I was lucky enough, but that wasn't a one-on-one meeting, so I can't give you an impression how it would have been if I were talking to them like I'm talking to you. But clearly,
was there some like characteristic maybe that you observed being in the same room as them that maybe wouldn't come across to people just watching him on TV, Mr. Putin?
his eyes, lots of people comment about his eyes. I don't know how to describe it, but his eyes are different. The way he looks at people, maybe the depth, but clearly he doesn't have to open up his mouth to talk. He can talk with his eyes, and you probably would know what he's saying before you hear him saying it.
I think I remember the second George Bush said something about his eyes as well. Back when relations were, obviously much better than they are now. But yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was. He said, I look into his eyes or something and I see a friend or something.
A soul or a human being or something like that. Yeah. Mr. Putin clearly is a thinker, and you see that thinker face, it's not questionable. He thinks.
Everything he does is deliberate.
I think he probably is a good chess player because he's not impulsive. Impressed is not the right word in those circumstances, but clearly he's a figure. He's a historical figure, and it was interesting for me.
So this second time that you met him, was that the last time, or were there others?
Yes. No, it was 3 times. One in person. And one other thing I would say, he comes prepared. So he comes prepared. He asks the right questions. He either is briefed or prepares himself, but he knows the topic. It's not as if he's doing it on the spur. There is no arm waving. There was no arm waving. In the forum, it's slightly different because it's almost like a speech. So it's a written speech. And so when I met him in his residence, it was a more sort of free-flowing conversation. He was asking questions. Our CEO was there. Some other senior managers were there. So it was an exchange. And he was impressive to what extent he prepared himself.
Was it a particularly overwhelming setting, or was it just literally a house? It wasn't like a palace or anything.
It was, no. It was what I noted then. It was not huge. It was big enough, but was not huge. It wasn't opulent in the sense like some people say once a Ukrainian president that was ousted in 2014 had golden loos or things like that. Nothing of that. It was tastefully decorated. There were some pieces of art, but it was very normal in the sense that it could have been anybody else's house. It didn't strike me as the residence of the first person in Russia at the time. It's very practical. The way it was, the layout was very practical.
What about your impression of Medvedev? Because I think when you said you met the first time, he was technically the president at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah. I hadn't formed any impression different to what you would read in the Russian literature or press. He, of course, is known to be more of a liberal, and I shouldn't be saying that, but less of a thinker. As I said, the impression from Putin was that he would be thinking a few steps forward, Medvedev was maybe one step ahead in his decrees and actions. But he was a good talker. He was an engaging speaker. It was interesting to listen to him. They are different. Of course they are.
But was it clear that even then that Putin was still very much the one in charge, making the decisions and everything?
Yeah. But it was not from meeting them. In the meeting, look, I'm one of in those auditoriums in the St. Petersburg. You have 500 to 1,000 people, so it's nothing but a formal event, a formal speech. They come, they talk, they answer questions, they leave. In the style that I can comment on, they're very different. In the how convincing they are, they're very different. But it was obvious when Putin was the prime minister, he called the shots. It was very obvious. And it's not from the conferences, it's from his decisions on the economy, on the political. He still pretty much represented Russia on the political front. Remember this decision about Georgia at the time? It wasn't Medvedev's decision, it was Putin's decision. I think Putin is much more, in his ability to make decisions, he's much stronger. He doesn't have doubts in his righteousness. If he believes in something, he thinks it's the right thing to do. Whereas Medvedev, I think he's a doubter. He doubts a lot.
What do you think that foreign observers maybe miss about Putin? As in, like, people looking from the outside, what do they not get?
Today or back then?
Oh, either.
Over the years, the criticism around Putin's key mission to make Russia strong again is perceived by the West as threatening. And therefore, they just don't understand why certain decisions are made. If you ask about situation today, my advice would be to listen to what he's saying, because in fact, he pre-warns you about the consequences ahead of time, and people just don't believe it. I also think that a lot of information is not raising up to the surface in the information space when it should be. And it causes bias, and it causes ill-informed coverage. And as a consumer of information, I'm listening, if you take Ukrainian situation now, I'm listening to both narratives. And to me, it's very difficult to know where the truth is until I speak to people who are living through this hell, who are there, and then I can form my own judgment. And unfortunately, nowadays, the West and mass media, they just don't listen, they don't believe, they don't take effort to find out what the truth is. They speculate on emotions a lot. You know, there is a lot of fake news, and with modern IT technology, it's easy to do on both sides. But in terms
I've noticed
of
that they call him very, that's something that I have picked up on, is that in a lot of these Western pundits do describe him as being very emotional. I wonder if perhaps you would say something different.
Well, you would be, wouldn't you? It's a big gamble. It's a big decision. It's probably the biggest event or the biggest thing that happened to us in the last, since the Second World War.
But it sounds like, from what you've just, the impressions that you've had of him, is that it wouldn't have been something, it wouldn't have been a step that he took based on emotion. No, absolutely not. And again, I'm not going to take a view or a judgment on, but there was a long build up to that decision. It wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't impulsive, it was pre-planned. There is a plan for sure. Whether it's going according to his plan or not, I don't know, but there was a plan. And I wish we had an opportunity to have more of this objective analysis, because some of the reporting on both sides is just tears, devastation, and all of that is tragic. It's horrendous. It's horrid. I personally, when we had discussions after the Donetsk and Lugansk were recognized as independent republics by Putin, I was adamant there will be no more but that. Maybe some peacekeeping troops, maybe this. And then this special military operation happens, and I don't know what to think.
And I don't have a source in media, whatever media you take, that say, here are the facts on this side, here are the facts on that side. So to us, our family, we've used to host Ukrainian women to work with my mom, who is now 91, and she needed care. And because we're in the UK, she's in Russia, she needs somebody to help her. And whenever at the start we were thinking what nationality, it was always Ukrainians or Russians, because we're the same ethnic group. We're Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, we're coming from the same root. So yeah, of course, we should look for a Ukrainian woman, because the cuisine is similar, culturally we're similar, language is similar, everything is similar. And some women worked with us for 5 years, it's a long time. And we treated them as members of our family. Mom went to have some treatments in Israel. She traveled with her. She went to the summer house to have a summer rest, break. They went with her. Food, there wasn't special table for mom and special table for a carer. It was all common. If they needed to, whatever, it was a member. So it's heartbreaking to know now that some of those women are caught up in this fight. More so that they themselves recognize that, say, their parents are in Donetsk and they're being bombed and shelled constantly without a break for the last 3-4 weeks, living out of the basement without water, food, and they're scared to go out. One of their family members was drafted into the Donetsk army. Now, this particular carer I'm referring to, she is on the Ukrainian-controlled territory. Her brother was drafted into the Ukrainian army, and they haven't heard from either of them for days. And you see members of the same family are on the opposing sides and killing each other. How could you? Of course it's emotional. It's nothing but emotional, and it's awful. And I can only hope that it will finish soon. But behind all of this horrid situation, there are deeper reasons on both sides which have to be somehow put together and the compromise reached that will be long-lived and sustainable. And that is a difficult part, I think.
Well, having said that, some of these carers came from the Donbas region. It won't be a surprise probably if anyone watching is Russian, but for people in that part of Ukraine, this conflict didn't begin 4 weeks ago. Can you maybe speak to their experience or their families' experiences over the past 8 years, or when exactly this began?
Yeah, well, that conflict began in 2014, and that was shortly after this Maidan in Kiev took place, when then he was democratically elected President Yanukovych was ousted. And the basis probably was a sound one. The people were fed up with corrupt government and money essentially not being directed at the benefit of the people. But what happened concurrently with that, there was a lot of nationalistically orientated participants. And the sentiment of let's cleanse the government and get somebody who is better for the people got merged with anti-Russian sentiment. And you could go back and see documentaries from the time when there were, slogans, kill the Russians and all that stuff. Then Crimea happened because, again, you can have an argument or debate what was behind it. But Crimea happened, and in eastern Ukraine, people started experiencing some of the decisions of the new government that were anti-Russian, such as Russian language was no longer permissible. You can speak casually, but Russian schools started to close, or the Russian people were announced as non-core groups in Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine wasn't even allowed to participate in the recent elections. So it was like civil rights defeat in some ways. But back then, the Eastern Ukrainians, they put forward the proposal to be part of Ukraine on a federal basis so that they can have some autonomy and some special rights that other Ukrainians wouldn't. And they were not allowed to. And that's where the problem started. And in those years, a lot of ethnic Russians have been killed. Now, some people say that that's not without Russia supporting those separatists with equipment, military equipment, some other financial help, etc. But when the first time I had it, I couldn't believe it was true. So it's between 13 and 16,000 Russian ethnics in eastern Ukraine were killed since 2014, with the first several years being the most difficult ones. Then it sort of quietened down, and now again they're being bombed and shelled. And the Ukrainian army, it sort of moved its regiments close to the eastern Ukrainian border, and clearly there was a military conflict. Now, I took the trouble of checking those numbers because some people were saying to me it's a lie, it's not true. And I went and checked. There is a UN report that actually records it. There's also UN, not UN, the United States Congress decisions. I think the last one was in 2017, acknowledging that some of the military legions in Ukraine, specifically the legions of Aidar and Azov, they're based on neo-Nazi ideology. And when I say that, or people say that, the immediate question, how could it be? Because Zelensky himself is a Jew. He was persecuted. We know what happened to Jews, Holocaust, all the horrible things. So it can't be. Now, in fact, if you check it out, the supremacy ideology is not directed to a particular ethnic group. It could be any ethnic group. And in this case, they made annihilation of Russians as the basis of their position. And if you look even at the attributes they are wearing, they have a black sun that Goebbels used to have in his house in Germany on the floor, on the marble floor, on their uniforms. They are using the slogans that were predominantly used by neo-Nazis in the Second World War. So there is an attribute of that. So it is true to say that neo-Nazism as an ideology is probably not the one that is predominant in Ukraine. In the last elections, I think it was only 1.62% of population that voted for those open neo-Nazi parties or groups. But it's not the point. When the war is going on, you can have 2% of people supporting you in the election, and nonetheless, those legions can cause massive devastation. So, and I think that's the angle that is dangerous. That's the angle that is not properly reported or even understood. And I think that it's not unexpected when we see those horrible pictures of people being trapped in theaters and the hospitals being destroyed. But when you think about it also from a standpoint of who is actually fighting. And you see those neo-Nazis are there taking the front line and fighting the Donetsk, and the rest is still being shelled. It puts a little different lens on your understanding of what the true origin of the conflict might be, and it becomes a risk, a broader risk, not just to this particular conflict. It becomes a broader risk to, and you ask yourself a question: is it almost a revenge that we're seeing post the Second World War, when Nazis were defeated, and now they're using this opportunity to come back? What is it? I don't know what the answer is, but there is a lot of question when you start getting this information, you start checking it, you start analyzing it. And to me, my heart is just absolutely broken to see what's going on. But I do not believe it's a local conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's Ukraine is being, in a way, used, and I also feel it. It's not clear to me whether Western leaders who made decisions to arm Ukraine with weapons to such extent, and not being prepared to put troops on the ground, knowing that Ukraine ultimately can't win because it's just smaller, it doesn't have the same military power. What kind of responsibility are they taking for throwing Ukraine in this fire of merciless deaths? And shouldn't they be calling for cessation of fighting immediately and peace talks and facilitate whatever agreement could be facilitated just to stop people being killed? When I say things like that, I actually was asked the other day, well, would you give Kaliningrad up, or would you give up any part of Russian territory if the situation was reversed? I don't have an answer to that question, nor do I think we should pose it that way and make up hypothetical examples, what you would have done if certain things were different. I don't know what the answer would be. All I know, I want peace, I want people stop being killed, and I want, I'm really not sure what's going to happen next. Because the devastation, the destruction, how do you rebuild this country from where it's now?
On the neo-Nazi question, I have found it very noticeable, and just speaking personally, I think incredibly irresponsible the degree to which so many voices have really bent over backwards to avoid discussing that fact. And it's like, if you find yourself on the same side as neo-Nazis in any conflict, or not even necessarily a war, I mean, surely that should, end of discussion, you would think, and that's the only explanation really I can think of for the lack of discussion on it. Because if more people...
It's not convenient to think that way.
Yeah, it should be unconscionable to say, oh yeah, we're backing a particular side in a war, and that just happens to be the same side as neo-Nazis, neo-Nazi militant groups.
The problem is that people don't believe that's true. That's the problem. People don't believe it. And why don't they believe it? Because those who are meant to investigate and to give objective facts are not doing it. Why are they not doing it? Because there is a political call for something else. And what is this something else? And that's what you said, what people don't understand about Putin. Putin wants to make Russia great again, to use Trump's words. And others don't want that. Why would they want it? Because now, if you think about future event, God forbid there will be some insane leader who will press the button, and I can hear, leaders in Poland and leaders in Ukraine. So what? Let's just engage in a local nuclear war. There won't be a local nuclear war. That will be the end of the world. But God forbid this is going to happen. I think we are at the start of major shifts in the world on everything. You talk about geopolitical security, it will be different. Financial systems will look different. Logistical systems will look different. Energy systems will be different. Everything will be different. The extent and the depth of the crisis that will lead to clarity around how this different world would look like is yet to be tested. But the truth of the matter is that we are witnessing the breakup of the world as we have known it. And of course, people are scared because it is uncertain what we're facing, and we don't know, whether getting there is going to be more or less painless. But it will be a shared pain. It will be a shared pain for sure. I just hope that the new forms of cooperation or listening to each other or comprehending each other's positions rather than just outright, that's a lie, that's not true, that's horse. It needs to take a different form for the world to become a happy place again. And that will, lots of people I know are waiting the world to go back to normal. There will be no known normal, like your unknowns unknown. It'll be an unknown normal, and whatever it might be. It might be 10,000 times worse than the previous normal, but we don't know what it is.
Well, you're the first person I've interviewed that's actually made reference to the title, which for people who are unaware is obviously a riff on that famous saying by Donald Rumsfeld about known unknowns and so on. But going back to your mother's Ukrainian carers, do you know where they are now, what their situation is?
One of them had to flee the Ukraine, and she called me and she said that she has two sons. They're not allowed to leave Ukraine because everybody between the age of 18 and 60 can't leave the country. They can be called into the army anytime. But she, with her daughter-in-law and grandchild, had to go out. In fact, Lena was working in Moscow at the time it happened. So her daughter-in-law and the grandchild went to Polish border. She said that unfortunately all the money they had to use on passing the blog posts. That's another piece of information that I didn't see in any press. That
Passing the what? Passing the what?
Passing blog posts, those military posts, controlling the movement.
Oh, checkpoints, right.
Checkpoints, that's how you call it in Ukraine. Then they call block posts because they have blocked the roads with big bricks or big stones or whatever, and they have military personnel there. So, and she said they have to pay them to be able to get through. Now, somebody is making money out of people's hardships on those refugees already in Ukraine, okay? And then they went to Lithuania. So all I could do to help is to send them some money to survive for the first time. So it was about 2,000 euros. And I said, why don't you come to us? Because we'll be happy to host you here. And she said, from a logistical and admin standpoint, UK, and mind it was about 2 weeks ago, so maybe things improved now. But back then, it was very difficult for them to get clearance to go to the UK because people were asking for like proof of residence. Hell, they fled their house. They wouldn't have any proof of residence. So it was difficult. So they preferred to stay in Lithuania. But I'm still telling her anytime, because we will be happy to help, because to us, she was the one looking after my father in his years before he passed. So it was like, she is family. She's family, and we'll do anything to help her. But she's sick, worried about her boys who are still in Ukraine. They live in the village not far from this Zaporozhskaya nuclear station, which was on the news a couple of weeks ago with fire. People there are saying that it's all they can hear is the sound of bombs and shooting, but where they are in this village, it's quiet still. So yeah, it's heartbreaking. Imagine, you're starting all over again with all the uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen, with responsibility over young kids, with your children left behind. It's a torment for any mother, and I can't but think how awful it is, and how peace should prevail. The sooner the better. Mm. And if I were anywhere near to advising the Ukrainian president, I would have taken a position. And if it takes neutrality, I don't see anything wrong with that. If it takes Crimea to be formally acknowledged as Russian, de facto it is Russian. And Eastern Ukrainians, they don't want to be part of Ukraine as they've known it. So something has to change. So, but that's me talking from a standpoint of a mother, a woman who can't rationalize that much suffering and that much killing and deaths. And equally, I would say that on the Russian side, don't know if anything could be done. The Russian news is reporting that they will go to the end. I don't know what the end is. That's my problem. Is I don't know what the end game is. I don't, it's good to say denazification, militarization. Demilitarization I probably can understand, but what is denazification? A lot of Ukrainian population during the Second World War were collaborationists with the Germans. So what does that mean? If we haven't carved it out in so many years in the Soviet Union, I just don't understand it. And that's my problem and my question to the Russian side. So it needs to be balanced on of course, solution. The solution is there.
Well, that made me think of your father's past experience, where like using such broad, sweeping words like denazification would easily sweep up, people that have absolutely no connection with anything or anyone that could be described as neo-Nazi. And of course, your father experienced firsthand what having those kinds of sweeping accusations leveled at one
absolutely.
can do.
Absolutely, and I'm convinced. I'm 100% convinced that majority of Ukrainians, they want to live in peace with Russia because we are the same family. It's not as if we've been enemies and it's now just came up unexpectedly. We're the same people, we're the same family, we have common history. Kiev is the city of Mother Russia. So it's absolutely heartbreaking to see it's going on.
Do you think that communal sense will perhaps survive the conflict? Because it is so much of a lived reality that people will...
I'm afraid we have created problems that will last many generations. But the longer it goes, the deeper the wound.
Well, I was hoping to maybe end on a slightly more positive note if possible, but I guess it probably isn't given the circumstances. Except that I suppose I have heard that the visa or the asylum system in the UK is noticeably becoming easier, so it may well be doable for your friends in Lithuania to actually get to the UK, probably.
Yeah. The positive is that every war comes to an end sooner or later, and that's what we should be focused on the end, where people, displaced people, go back to their homes. They start living as normal life as possible, and there is nobody feels threatened or shelled or bombed on the basis of their ethnicity, and that somehow this relationship between Russia and Ukraine becomes one of friends rather than conflict. And that's the positive. I'm sure it will happen, but how do we get that? It might be a difficult journey still. But I think that's the positive you should be focused on.
Well, we've discussed nearly a century of defining events and periods in modern history, but I think your reflections on it have really rooted, I guess, given it a kind of, a sort of reality to it, as someone who lived through parts of it and also whose parents lived through part of it and were involved in it at a very high level. So yeah, it's been incredibly enlightening and interesting to hear such a unique family history as you have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.